The world continues to battle the coronavirus. It's especially bad here in the United States, as well as, of course, in Brazil, India, Africa. Other nations are having a difficult time. Um, and I know Africa is a continent, but nations in Africa are also having a difficult time, some of them anyway, fighting this virus. And so now, as we continue to do that, I'm reminded about how this kind of is a dry run for what's going to happen during climate change. And so I recently came across a study that backed that up. So this study warns that if we continue to do nothing when it comes to climate change, we don't do things like very bold ideas like the Green New Deal, for example. We just, basically do business as usual or do very, very little change. The global death rate, and that's what this is saying, from climate crisis could equal or even exceed the current mortality levels from not just one, but all infectious diseases combined by 2100. Now, the study is titled Vaulting, or I'm sorry, Vaulting. Uh, Interesting slip there. Valuing the global mortality consequences of climate change, accounting for adaptation costs and benefits. Look, that's the study, right? And so it was recently published in the National Bureau of Economic Research. And according to the Climate Impact Lab, which produced a report, the study found out that in a world with continued high fossil fuel emissions, warmer temperatures will rank among the world's most significant public health threats by the end of the century. Now, the Climate Lab explains, quote, the study projects that climate change's effect on temperatures could raise global mortality rates by 73 deaths per 100,000 people in 2100 under a continued high emission scenario. Hey, do you know what scenario, what we're operating under right now? High emissions. Yeah. And so now they compare it to a world with no warming, right? And so the level of death, 73 per 100,000 people, is roughly equal to the current death rate for all infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, malaria, dengue, yellow fever, and diseases transmitted by ticks, mosquitoes, and parasites combined, which is approximately 74 deaths per 100,000 globally. So, okay, well, wait a minute. So, how exactly is climate change going to be more dangerous in the long run, right, than all current infectious diseases? Well, okay, so let's look at an example, right? Syria. Wait, Syria? What does Syria have to do with any of this? Well, okay, so I remember back when Bernie Sanders was talking about the Syrian civil war as a partly of a product of the results of climate change. Okay, partly a product of climate change and the effects thereof. And so he got laughed at by the establishment. He got laughed at by the right wing. And it turns out, whoops, you had some pretty bad climate conditions that exacerbated the political situation, the already unstable political situation in Syria. And so, yeah, that led to even more political instability, of course, uh, in the nations that the refugees from that crisis, from that civil war, actually went to. And so that war, again, also took a toll on a lot of people, millions of people. So now imagine all of the Middle East, right, going through something similar, a massive, massive drought as a result of climate change. And then not able to grow food. So you got food shortages in the area. And so we're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions, possibly of refugees. Where are they going to all go? Who's going to let them in? What if they start fighting each other for the right to get into certain countries? That's just one of the impacts, right? It all kind of cascades. When they talk about the snowball, I mean, the snowball effect, because you ain't going to have no snowballs with, massive climate change, or at least not as many. Hyperbole, guys. It's going to be bad. Okay, all of those effects rolled into each other are going to, one thing spirals off the next, and then the next, and that creates another problem, wars, instability, water, fighting over water, fighting over supplies, fighting over food. You're just going to have a massive amount of death. Okay. And as co-author Amir Jina, who is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, said, quote, "It's plausible we could have the worst case scenario, and that would involve drastic measures such as lots of people migrating, mass migration, much like when COVID overwhelms the healthcare system. It's hard to tell what will happen when climate change will put systems under pressure like that." Yeah. Also consider, again, wars over water, resource wars, famine, that kind of disease, okay, adding into that. And also the effects of more extreme weather themselves, stronger storms, more floods, hurricanes, crisis level stuff, okay? And of course, as always, the poor suffer the most, poorer countries especially, and so that leads to even more death. Report co-author Michael Greenstone, a University of Chicago economics professor, also said this. He says, "Our data indicate that with the continued growth of greenhouse gas emissions, the temperature effects of climate change are projected to be about 5 times deadlier than recent U.S. flu seasons. In poor countries especially, the heat may be even more threatening than cancer and heart disease are today." Another factor, ironically, is more diseases, right? So, look, as permafrost melts, you've got bacteria, viruses that were frozen in the ice. They get released, many of which we don't have an immunity to. So, kind of like coronavirus, which is already devastating, it could actually end up being worse than coronavirus. And we don't have an immunity to it, which again means more death. But if somehow you are completely unconcerned about the human cost, oh man, yeah, hey, that sucks, right? But what about the economy, bro? Well, I got bad news for you. You're a sociopath, and the economy is going to be devastated as well. Now, the study also found the economic cost of addressing the climate crisis will only increase if little or nothing is done to reduce emissions. So, look, it's already going to be a decent investment, right? A large investment for any nation. It's not impossible. It's not something that we can't afford to do, because in reality, we actually can't afford not to do it. So it has to be done regardless. But we actually have the first world. We have the resources to be able to do so. Maybe instead of, bombing brown people in the Middle East all day, we could take some of that money and use it to install solar panels instead, right? All across the country, and make our buildings a bit greener, not literally, but as far as, more energy conscious, and really gear ourselves to switch off of fossil fuels basically as soon as possible. Okay. It will take a significant investment, but we can do it. And that also means jobs, right? So now let me break down the costs here from that study. Emitting 1 additional ton of CO2 today costs ourselves and future generations a total of $36.6 under a continued high emission scenario, and $17.1 under a moderate emission scenario. So that's just per ton of CO2, right? That's what it costs us in the world. Do you know how much we emit in America in a year? 5.1 billion tons. That was 2017 alone. And since then, of course, the Trump administration has managed to eliminate regulations on coal plants and other, fossil fuel sources of energy, right? And so we could be emitting even more. Well, to be fair, under coronavirus, since we got coronavirus, actually helped to buy us some time, since we're not emitting as much pollution because our economy has come to a little bit of a stop. So now that said, we've got natural sinks to offset carbon, right? And so unfortunately, when it comes to that, our sinks have been filling up. Okay. Basically, the ocean is one of the largest places where the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere actually goes. It's absorbed into the ocean. Now, ocean is pretty vast, right? So you think, well, it can hold a lot of carbon. We're actually getting pretty close to getting to a point of where we put too much carbon into the ocean. I mean, for example, we've got now ocean acidification. Um, we've got mass coral bleaching as a result of that. We have species of mollusk or certain species that can no longer develop hard shells. We've got the destabilization of ocean life, which will impact fisheries, of course, which are already being overfished at this point. There's also dead spots literally in the ocean where there is no oxygen. Yes, marine life also needs oxygen to survive. And this is, since carbon dioxide is basically replacing this oxygen, not good. Not good at all. And so, going back to the economic point, you have the fishing industry that collapses because there's no more fish or there are limited quantities of fish now. Well, that's going to affect a lot of coastline economies, communities, global food supply, shipping supplies. Basically, everything is connected. Okay. And if we destabilize one part of the world, the rest of it feels it. So it's going to be a disaster. Now, the thing is, and this is what we don't get, this is why we're not doing anything about it, other than, of course, greed, is that it's a slow problem, right? So that's both a benefit and a problem, right? Because the benefit is, well, since it is happening more, slowly, we can do something about it now and mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, we as a species tend to ignore the problems until the last minute. And this is not something that you can solve at the last minute because carbon is cumulative. And right now, we're only beginning to experience the impact of carbon we put into the atmosphere a long time ago. The stuff that we're doing now will come due with our children and grandchildren become of age. And so that led, of course, University of California public policy professor Solomon Sang, one of the report's co-authors, to say, quote, we're now studying the risk of death faced by our own children. Today's 10-year-old fifth grader will turn 65 in 2075, facing mortality risks from climate change every year of their retirement, if they're lucky enough to have one. And failing to address climate change is not that different from driving your kids around without a seatbelt. You are putting their lives at risk. Gina added that if we let it get bad enough through inaction, people will need to choose between paying a high cost to adapt or death. So, literal adapt or die. Great. Fantastic. That said, it's not hopeless. Okay. Trevor Hauser, a partner and analyst at firm Rhodium Group, another report co-author, said this: the world can still change course by aggressively reducing emissions, and in doing so, has the potential to deliver some of the most significant public health gains in human history. And so, look, obviously with Donald Trump, we're not going to have that. And with Joe Biden, we're certainly not going to have enough aggressive action. But at this point, we don't have much of a choice. Okay. It's either we continue to slide backwards on the climate, or we at least go back to where we were 4 years ago, right? And maybe a little bit further. Biden's climate plan isn't quite as bad. It's not as good as Bernie Sanders' plan, of course, or as a progressive plan. It's not the Green New Deal, but it is something a little bit better. So that's something to keep in mind as the election draws near, because we have to do something, because we cannot afford to do nothing.